Hello everybody and welcome to Galbraith Does Psych. This is another episode in a series where I take studies from psychology, particularly the AQA A-level, and I go through some background, do a bit of revision, and offer you my thoughts in terms of evaluation. So I go through key criteria like validity and applications, ethics, that sort of thing. We weigh it all up, give it a score, and I offer you some advice about how this might come up in the exam. Is it worth learning? When are you going to use it? All that sort of thing. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this one. Today we're going to be talking about the study that was done on duration of the short-term memory by husband and wife team Lloyd and Margaret Peterson. So what they did was they had a sample of 24 psychology students from Indiana University, and they presented them with a series of trigrams, they called them. So a bit like what you can see in the middle of the screen there, for example, T, J, F, M, W, L, and so on. So strings of 3 consonants. So they presented them one at a time, and then they would say a random 3-digit number, for example, 791. Once that number has been heard, the participants had to count backwards until a little light flashed up. And the light would flash up after, for example, 3 seconds, or after 6 seconds, after 9 seconds, 12 seconds, and so on. When the light flashed, they had to recall the trigram that they'd been presented with. So, you can see in terms of the findings, I've got a graph from their original paper on the screen there. You don't need to know the exact data, but you can see, as perhaps you would expect, the recall has decreased, or their performance has gotten worse the longer the interval between being presented with the trigram and having to recall it. And that all makes sense given what we know nowadays about how memory works, because if you think about it, what's the point of that counting backwards task? It's preventing rehearsal. So we know about the rehearsal loop and the role of maintenance rehearsal from the multi-store model. Okay. So firstly, let's dive right into internal validity. It was a controlled and standardized procedure. All participants faced the same task. It was carefully timed. The experimenter spoke in the same kind of way. It was all done kind of rhythmically in line with a metronome. Okay, so the participants all had the same conditions. That means we are controlling extraneous variables. There's no kind of distractions, there's no variability in how the experimenters are talking to the participants. It's all scripted, all that sort of thing. So that means it's a nice replicable procedure, which is more of a reliability thing, but in terms of internal validity, it means we can be more sure that the results that we have found in this study are in fact about the duration of STM, so therefore it has internal validity. As I mentioned previously, they are preventing the rehearsal in the STM by doing that counting backwards task. And again, that just stops the participants from going over it in their minds and therefore perhaps only really hanging on to the information for a second or two at a time, in between repeating it in their minds. So that means that we can be more sure that Peterson and Peterson did in fact find that the duration of STM is 18 to 30 seconds. That said, is there a risk of demand characteristics? It's an artificial setting, so the participants knew they were part of an experiment, and as I mentioned earlier, they were psychology students, so they were likely to be aware of research into memory already. But on balance, is it likely that they have significantly changed how their memory works? Did they kind of go in as students and think, oh, I know, I'll get progressively worse as the duration goes on? Maybe, maybe not. Memory isn't necessarily the easiest thing to fake in that kind of pattern, unless you kind of go in knowing what you're doing. And we're not sure, but it's possibly not the biggest issue in this particular study. Overall, I'm quite happy with this study in terms of internal validity, and I award it a 9 out of 10. On to external validity. Is it going to be as good as the internal validity? Spoiler alert, probably not. It was an artificial task. How often in your everyday life do you have to learn a meaningless string of 3 letters and then not be allowed to repeat it? You've got to count backwards randomly, and then you have to wait for a light, and then you have to say it again, and then we keep doing this in progressive. Yeah, it's not something that you would do in your everyday life. So does it really tell us about real life memory? Possibly not. And linked to this is the setting itself. Does it apply outside of that lab setting when you've had a task explained to you, you know you're in an experiment, and we're with people that we don't really know? Is that how our memory works in real life? Again, probably not. Possibly the results are partly influenced by being in that kind of lab setting and kind of being pressured to perform on the day, maybe. They were American psychology students, as mentioned already, and I think the obvious criticism here is, that doesn't apply outside of American students, and I'm kind of on board with that, but we have to ask ourselves, is it likely that that is an issue for this particular study? So looking at how short-term memory works. So the issue of them being American, is it likely that a different culture or a different country, are their memories going to be significantly different in terms of how they work? Probably not really. The fact that they're students, though, maybe that is an issue. Students tend to be younger, they tend to be used to memorising and recalling things, so possibly they might have done a little bit better than your average member of the population on this task. So maybe there are some question marks around the generalisability in terms of that. It was done in the 1950s. Again, it's a fairly common criticism when you've got an old study to talk about a lack of temporal validity. But again, ask yourself, is it a problem in this study? Yeah, don't be generic. The examiners do not really like that. Is it likely that nowadays our short-term memory works in a significantly different way? Well, again, probably not, but actually possibly when you think about it. If you think about, the attention span that people have nowadays has decreased as a result of all this kind of technology, social media, tapping and swiping. We do, I think, process things in a slightly different way to what people would have done 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. Whether or not that's massively different is up for debate, but it is a possible issue that I could see, if you argued it well, would get you some credit. Overall, there are some issues, there are some flaws. I'm afraid, as much as I like the Peterson team, it's a 4 out of 10 from me. Next up, ethics. They were given clear, honest instructions. They were told what was going to happen. They knew it was a memory study. They were not deceived. That's good. That said, participation was required. I said they were psychology students. It was a part of their course. They got credit for participating in research. Now, is it a massive issue? Probably not. But it does raise the question of, were they just going along with it because they were getting something out of it, as opposed to, freely participating? This is something that, if you go on to do a degree, particularly in a sciencey kind of subject, you will probably have to participate in research as a requirement of your course as well. So you'll have this. Is it an issue? Well, if you sign up to a study and then actually withdraw, you still get given credit. So it's probably not a massive issue in actual fact. There's no harm done as a result of this study. Remember, the key responsibility is to ensure that your participants are protected from harm, both physical and psychological, in terms of looking after them. And there's no harm here. Confidentiality is a good point here. We're not aware that any personal information has ever been published. There's no kind of names or anything like that in the paper. And so, we've got that issue of, were they a little bit pressured because they had to participate for their course? But overall, there aren't really any significant issues here. There's lots that's done right by the Peterson team here, and it gets a 9 out of 10 from me on ethics. In terms of applications then, it is a useful study for understanding how learning and memory works, It's good in terms of understanding that STM has a duration of 18 to 30 seconds. We probably didn't need to do a load of studies to work out that short-term memory is indeed short. But I think what is interesting about this one is the role of rehearsal. And again, nowadays it kind of sounds like common sense, but it does show us that being able to rehearse in a focused kind of way and repeat things to yourself is really important for learning. And I think, you can read into that and go, well, in my revision, in my lessons, I need to focus on rehearsal and not allow myself to be distracted. So I think there's something in there in terms of applications. But as we talked about, it doesn't have, the best external validity. And so the question is, how useful is this study? How useful are its applications for us if we're not really sure in the first place if it applies in real life? And so that does take something away from it in quite a fundamental way, I think. And so I'm afraid, given that, the findings aren't the most groundbreaking in the first place, that external validity issue does take something away, and I'm giving it, I'm afraid, 4 out of 10. Okay, so those are some thoughts on evaluating the study itself. Let's talk a little bit about the exam. So memory appears in paper 1 of the AQA course for psychology, and unfortunately for the Petersons, this is not on the course as a key study, so that will take something away from my score here. You're not going to get an essay just on this particular study, but it is quite useful because you are likely to be asked about research into memory. There are questions asking about research into the STM, and I've seen questions asking specifically about research into the duration of memory. So this would be I won't say key, but this would be the main study to go for. And this is what the examiners will be expecting to see. That doesn't mean you have to use it, but this is what will appear on mark schemes, this is what's in the textbook, and like I said, they'll be looking for it. So it probably is worth you getting to know this one. It's also quite useful for dealing with research methods and understanding the concepts behind some of those things. They do like to ask research methods questions throughout the course, as you know, and they do appear often in the memory section. So understanding things like control and consent and all that sort of thing, as well as the fact that, and I've seen questions like this, the fact that you could talk about how artificial some of the studies into memory are. I think there's definitely some value in learning studies like this one. And so, it's not a key study, so it does take away a little bit, but I'm giving the Peterson study a 6 out of 10 for exam value. Okay, so where are we overall? Well, we scored 9 for internal validity, 4 for external validity, 9 for ethics, 4 for applications, and a 6 for exam value. The sums score to 32, so therefore the mean, which is the score that I'm giving the Peterson and Peterson study, they get a 6.4 out of 10. That brings us to the end of the video. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you found elements of that useful at least. If you're interested in looking at some other kind of free resources, I've got exam style questions, revision sheets, lesson slides, all that sort of thing on my blog, which is on the screen in front of you. Do let me know kind of what you think about this study. Do you agree with my scores? Are there other studies you think are more useful for looking at STM? Get involved in the comments and let me know if there are other particular studies that you would like me to cover in this way. Thanks very much, guys. I will see you, I hope, in another video. Bish bash bosh.